The crystal tiers of the chandelier wept light onto the polished marble floor of the grand ballroom. Each refracted gleam a silent witness to the city's practiced opulence. This was the annual St. Catherine's Legacy Gala, the crown jewel of the philanthropic season. An evening where fortunes were pledged in a murmur of calculated compliments, and the clinking of champagne flutes served as polite applause. Alara Vance moved through the gilded crowd with a grace that was both inherited and earned. She was the architect of this evening, the public face of a legacy she had reshaped from old money into new purpose. Her gown, a column of midnight silk, was an elegant whisper, not a shout, a perfect metaphor for the woman herself. Her husband, Julian, was a warm, solid presence at her side. His hand rested in the small of her back, a familiar anchor in a sea of performative smiles. He was a professor of architectural history, a man more comfortable with the quiet integrity of stone and steel than the brittle artifice of high society. But he was here for her, his love a quiet counterpoint to the room's gilded noise. "You're 1,000 miles away," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Alara offered him a small, genuine smile, a rare bloom in this cultivated garden, just counting the exits, a habit. He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound, still the pragmatist, even at your own coronation. It was true. Tonight, the St. Catherine's Hospital Foundation was honoring Alara with its prestigious Vanguard Award for her work in funding community health initiatives. Her name, the Vance name, was etched onto the hospital's newest wing, a testament to a fortune now dedicated to public good. But beneath the serene surface, a current of old anxieties ran deep. She saw the room not just as a space of celebration, but as a container of potential threats, a fire hazard, a structural weakness, a security breach. It was a vigilance born from a past she kept locked away, a past of smoke and sirens and the suffocating helplessness of a child whose pleas had gone unheard. The master of ceremonies, a local news anchor with a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, was approaching the podium. And now, to present the Vanguard Award to a woman whose vision and generosity have reshaped the future of healthcare in our city. Please welcome the esteemed head of cardiology at St. Catherine's, Dr. Alistair Finch. A wave of respectful applause followed Finch to the stage. He was the picture of medical authority, silver-haired, impeccably tailored, with a smile that conveyed both immense charm and an unshakable confidence in his own importance. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose hands were said to perform miracles inside the human heart. To Alara, he was a necessary component of the machine she was trying to improve, a man whose professional reputation lent credence to her philanthropic efforts. "Alara Vance," Finch began, his voice resonating through the ballroom, a name synonymous with grace, intelligence, and a profound commitment to the well-being of others. "It is my distinct honor." As he spoke, Julian's hand tightened on her arm. Alara glanced at him. A subtle sheen of sweat had appeared on his brow. His smile suddenly strained. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her focus shifting entirely from the stage to him. "Just a bit of indigestion," he said, attempting a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He discreetly pressed a hand to the center of his chest. "The canapes, I suppose." But Alara saw the flicker of pain in his gaze, the unnatural gray pallor that had begun to creep into his skin beneath the warm, golden light of the ballroom. The shallow catch in his breath was a sound only she could hear, a discordant note in the symphony of the gala. Finch was concluding his remarks, and so, with a deep sense of gratitude, "I invite Alara Vance to the stage to accept this year's Vanguard Award." The room erupted in applause. It was a wave of sound that felt distant, muffled. All of Alara's senses were focused on Julian. His grip on her arm was now a vice, his knuckles white. "Julian," she said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to go." He tried to stand as she did, but a sharp, ragged gasp escaped his lips, and he staggered, his weight slumping against her. The applause faltered, replaced by a ripple of concerned murmurs. Dr. Finch, award in hand, stepped down from the stage, his charming smile morphing into one of professional concern. "Is everything quite all right here?" "My husband is having chest pains," Alara said, her voice unnervingly calm. A tightrope of control stretched over a chasm of rising panic. "He needs help. Now." Finch's eyes flickered over Julian. A quick, dismissive appraisal. He then looked at Alara, his expression a masterpiece of polite condescension. "My dear," he said, his voice just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "A bit of indigestion from the canapes. I'm sure. A touch of heartburn can be quite dramatic." He gave a placating smile to the onlookers. "Let's not make a scene." The phrase struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. "Let's not make a scene." The gilded ballroom dissolved, the murmur of the crowd fading into a roar. For a split second, she was no longer a poised philanthropist in a silk gown, but a small girl in a smoke-filled hallway, coughing, crying, pulling on the sleeve of a firefighter whose face was a grim mask of soot. "My parents are still in there," she had screamed, her small voice raw. "Please, you have to help them." The firefighter had looked down at her, his eyes filled with a weary pity she was too young to understand. "It's too late, kid," he'd said, turning away to deal with the larger, more manageable crisis of the collapsing roof. "We can't risk it. Let's not make a scene." Her pleas, ignored. Her world, reduced to ash. The memory, sharp and acrid, receded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. The panic vanished, replaced by a fury so pure and absolute it felt like ice in her veins. Her composure, which the crowd mistook for shock, was a mask, but it was not a mask of weakness. It was the calm, collected face of a predator that has just identified its prey. She looked at Alistair Finch, truly looked at him, and saw not a respected physician, but an obstacle, an arrogant, dismissive man who had just made the gravest mistake of his life. He had mistaken her control for fragility. He had ignored her plea, and in doing so, he had unwittingly reopened a wound that had never truly healed, awakening a part of Alara Vance that the world had never seen, and would soon have cause to fear. "Dr. Finch," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying an authority that cut through the surrounding whispers. "You will call for a hospital gurney and a full cardiac team to meet us at the emergency entrance. You will do it now, or you will regret it for the rest of your remarkably short career." Finch's smile faltered, a flicker of surprise in his eyes at her tone, but before he could respond, Julian collapsed completely, his dead weight pulling Alara down with him onto the cold, unforgiving marble. The last thing she heard before the room descended into chaos was the sharp, definitive crack of the Vanguard Award as it slipped from Finch's hand and shattered on the floor. The antiseptic scent of St. Catherine's emergency room was a thin veneer over the primal smell of fear. Fluorescent lights hummed with a sterile indifference, casting long, distorted shadows on the polished linoleum floors. Julian lay on a gurney in a curtained-off bay, hooked up to a chorus of machines whose rhythmic beeps had become the metronome of Alara's anxiety. They had been here for 47 minutes. 47 minutes of condescending nurses, bureaucratic delays, and the maddeningly calm insistence on protocol. Dr. Finch had reappeared. his tuxedo replaced by the crisp white coat of his authority. His demeanor, however, remained unchanged, a placid surface of professional concern that failed to conceal the bedrock of his arrogance. "As I suspected, Mrs. Vance," he said, glancing at a chart with an air of profound boredom. "His initial EKG is inconclusive. We'll need to run a troponin assay, but the lab is rather backed up this evening. It could be a few hours." A few hours. Alara's voice was dangerously level. "My husband collapsed with crushing chest pain radiating down his left arm. You are the head of cardiology. You know as well as I do that inconclusive can mean a non-ST elevation myocardial infarction. You need to treat this as a cardiac event until proven otherwise." Finch gave her a patient, patronizing smile. "And you've been consulting Dr. Google." "I see. It's a common response for concerned family members. But I've been practicing medicine for 30 years. I believe I know how to distinguish between a genuine cardiac emergency and a severe case of esophageal spasm." He made a note on the chart. "We must be mindful of hospital resources. Ordering an emergency catheterization for what is likely a gastric issue would be imprudent." His words were carefully chosen. Imprudent. Resources. Gastric issue. Each one a polite dismissal. An insult wrapped in the language of clinical detachment. He was classifying them, marking them as unworthy of his full and immediate attention. It was the same veiled condescension from the gala, now translated into the life or death calculus of a hospital. Alara's gaze was fixed on Julian. His skin was still clammy, his breathing shallow. The pain had subsided into a dull, heavy ache, but the fear in his eyes was a constant, silent plea. This was not a man with heartburn. She pulled out her phone, her movements precise and deliberate. She opened a secure messaging app and sent a single sentence to a contact labeled Marcus Thorne. "St. Catherine's ER. Document everything." Marcus Thorne was her family's lawyer, a man whose loyalty was as unshakable as his hourly rate was exorbitant. He was more than a lawyer. He was a strategist, a keeper of secrets, a man who understood that information, meticulously gathered and strategically deployed, was the ultimate form of power. A moment later, a reply came. On it, "Investigator is 5 minutes out. Stay calm. Let them build our case for us." Alara slipped the phone back into her purse. A new kind of calm settled over her. The focused tranquility of a general surveying a battlefield. Finch and his bureaucracy were no longer just a source of frustration. They were an opponent, and their negligence was a weapon she would turn against them. She began to document, with the quiet focus of a researcher. She noted the time on the wall clock. She noted the name of the triage nurse, who had taken 20 minutes to assign them a bay. She took a photo of the monitor above the nurse's station that clearly showed Cardiac Cath Lab 1 available. She recorded a short audio memo on her phone, her voice a soft, steady whisper, detailing Dr. Finch's diagnosis of esophageal spasm and his refusal to escalate care. An hour bled into 2. The lab results for the troponin levels, the key indicator of heart muscle damage, remained pending. A shift change brought a new nurse, a young woman with a weary face who seemed flustered by Finch's explicit instructions to observe and wait. "His blood pressure is dropping," Alara stated, pointing to the monitor. 105/60. It was 130/85 when we arrived. The nurse, whose name tag read Chloe, glanced nervously toward the main desk. "Dr. Finch said to expect some fluctuation. He wants us to hold off on any intervention until the blood work comes back." "The fluctuation is called hypotension, and it's a sign of cardiogenic shock," Alara said, her voice edged with steel. "Get Dr. Finch back in here. Now." The nurse scurried away, and Finch returned minutes later, his expression one of pure annoyance. "Mrs. Vance, your persistent interruptions are becoming counterproductive. You must allow us to do our jobs." "Your job is to save my husband's life," Alara countered, standing to meet his gaze. "A job you are failing at with every passing minute. His condition is deteriorating. Any competent physician would have him in the cath lab by now." Finch's professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of raw ego. "Are you questioning my clinical judgment?" "I am stating a fact," Alara said coldly. "A fact that is being meticulously recorded by my legal team." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in Finch's eyes. The mention of a legal team had shifted the ground beneath his feet. He was no longer dealing with just an anxious wife. He was dealing with a potential adversary. He glanced at Julian's vitals, a subtle frown creasing his brow. "Very well," he conceded, his tone clipped. "I'll authorize a second troponin draw and put a rush on it. But this changes nothing. The protocol for inconclusive EKG is clear." He turned and left, a man retreating behind a wall of procedure. But Alara knew she had landed a blow. He was no longer acting out of pure arrogance, but out of a defensive need to protect himself. He was creating a paper trail to justify his inaction. And, in doing so, he was tightening the noose around his own neck. Minutes later, a man in a rumpled suit, who looked more like a tired academic than a private investigator, slipped into the waiting area. He caught Alara's eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod before taking a seat and opening a newspaper. This was Ben Carter, Marcus Thorne's secret weapon, a former investigative journalist with a Pulitzer to his name. Ben had a preternatural talent for digging up the truths people paid fortunes to keep buried. His presence meant the scope of Alara's counterattack had just expanded exponentially. She wasn't just fighting for Julian anymore. She was preparing for a war. The war would not be fought here, in the sterile corridors of a hospital that bore her family's name. It would be fought in boardrooms, in the press, and in the quiet. Hidden ledgers of power where reputations were made and destroyed. Dr. Alistair Finch had made a powerful enemy tonight. But what he could not possibly know was that his true enemy was not Alara Vance, the philanthropist. It was the ghost of a helpless little girl, now grown, who had learned a long time ago that when the world refuses to listen to your pleas, you must find a way to make it bend to your will. The rising action of a war is often silent. It is the gathering of intelligence, the mapping of terrain, the quiet positioning of assets. While Julian lay in a state of medically induced limbo, Alara launched her campaign. From a small, sterile family waiting room that reeked of stale coffee and disinfectant, she began to dismantle Dr. Alistair Finch's world, piece by meticulous piece. Her first front was corporate, the Vance family, through a series of trusts and holding companies, owned a 7% stake in Williams Medical Corporation, the parent company of St. Catherine's and a dozen other hospitals across the region. It wasn't a controlling interest, but it was enough to grant her access, a seat at the table, and a voice that could not be legally ignored. Her call to Marcus Thorne was brief and direct. "Marcus, I want everything on Finch, his patient outcomes, his mortality rates, any formal complaints sealed or otherwise. And I want a deep dive into the hospital's internal audits. I know they track patient wait times and treatment outcomes by demographic. I want to see the numbers." "They'll stonewall," Marcus warned, his voice a calm rumble over the phone. "Finch is a golden goose for that hospital. His cardiology department brings in millions." "My family's name is carved into the stone of that building," Alara replied, her voice devoid of emotion. "My minority shareholder rights, Give me the authority to request a performance review of any department head. They can stonewall, but it will be a matter of public record that they did so in response to a formal inquiry from a major benefactor. Let them. The second front was Ben Carter's investigation. Ben operated in the shadows, a ghost in the machine of public records and forgotten histories. He didn't start with Finch. He started with the system that protected him. His first dispatch to Alara was a simple list of names, the members of the hospital's peer review board, the body responsible for investigating complaints against doctors. A few hours of cross-referencing later, a pattern emerged. 3 of the 5 members had direct financial ties to Finch, either through shared medical patents or investments in boutique surgical device companies he championed. His jury was rigged. He's insulated, Ben reported in a coded text. The internal system is designed to protect him, not the patients. Then go external. Alara typed back. Look for lawsuits, settlements, anything that was handled quietly. People who were hurt by him, but paid to disappear. While Ben hunted for ghosts in legal archives, Alara focused on the present. She walked the halls of the hospital, not as a panicked wife, but as an auditor. She spoke to nurses, technicians, and orderlies. Her questions gentle, her demeanor one of concerned philanthropy. She asked about resources, about staffing levels, about the pressures of protocol. Most were guarded, but some, like the young nurse Chloe, saw an ally. Dr. Finch, he has his favorites, Chloe admitted in a hushed conversation near a vending machine. Patients. I mean, the ones who are, prominent donors. They get the best of everything. Instant attention. Others, they wait. He calls it managing resources. He says the system can't treat everyone like a VIP. And how does he decide who isn't a VIP? Alara asked, her gaze unwavering. Chloe's eyes darted down the hallway. I shouldn't say. But her silence was an answer in itself. Alara's mind cataloged the information, a 2-tiered system of care, sanctioned from the top. It was more than just arrogance. It was a deliberate, systemic pattern of neglect. By the 3rd day, Julian's condition had stabilized, though the official diagnosis remained maddeningly vague. The troponin levels had come back slightly elevated, indicative of minor cardiac strain, as Finch had put it, but not high enough to trigger the hospital's mandatory protocol for a major heart attack. He recommended a course of observation and medication. He was building his defense, creating a narrative of prudent, cautious medicine. But Alara's own narrative was growing stronger. Marcus Thorne's legal maneuvering had pried loose the demographic data she'd requested. The numbers were stark. At St. Catherine's, under Finch's departmental leadership, the average wait time for a minority patient presenting with chest pain to see a cardiologist was 48% longer than for a white patient with the exact same symptoms. The rate at which these patients were admitted for advanced cardiac care was 32% lower. It was a portrait of systemic bias painted in cold, hard data. It was the story of countless Julians, men and women whose pain was discounted, whose symptoms were dismissed, whose lives were deemed less valuable by the quiet, polite, protocol-driven prejudice of men like Alistair Finch. Then came the call from Ben Carter. His voice was different, the detached tone of the investigator replaced by something more urgent, more unsettled. Alara, I found something, he said. His words clipped. It's not a lawsuit. It's older. Much older. An old newspaper archive from the microfiche library. Are you somewhere you can talk? Alara stepped into an empty stairwell, the heavy fire door clicking shut behind her, sealing her in a world of concrete and silence. I am now. What is it? It's a factory fire, Ben said. 30 years ago. A textile mill on the south side of the city. Vance Textiles. It was your father's first major acquisition. Alara's blood ran cold. The fire, the origin point of her nightmares. I know about the fire, she said, her voice tight. My parents died in it. There was a moment of shocked silence on the other end of the line. God. Alara. I didn't know. It wasn't in any of the public files I pulled on your family. It was a private tragedy. Ben, we didn't publicize it. What does this have to do with Finch? The factory that burned down. It was situated on land adjacent to a smaller, family-owned business, a company called Finch Artisanal Dyes. The fire spread. It destroyed everything they had. They were uninsured, bankrupted overnight. Alara leaned against the cold concrete wall, a dizzying sense of vertigo washing over her. Finch. The name echoed in the silent stairwell. The newspaper article quotes the owner, a man named Thomas Finch. Ben continued, his voice soft now, as if reading a eulogy. He's quoted as saying that Harrison Vance, your father, had been trying to buy his land for months to expand the mill. He'd refused to sell. The fire was ruled an accident, faulty wiring. But Thomas Finch told the reporter he believed it was arson. He believed your father set the fire to drive him out of business. Alara's mind struggled to connect the pieces. A 30-year-old tragedy. A forgotten business dispute. Thomas Finch had 2 children, Ben said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. An older son, and a younger daughter. The daughter, Amelia, was asthmatic. She was playing near the dye works when the smoke rolled in. She suffered severe smoke inhalation. She died 2 days later in the hospital. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. A soundless, devastating impact. The son, Alara whispered, already knowing the answer. The older son's name was Alistair. Yes. Ben confirmed. Dr. Alistair Finch. The fire destroyed his family's business, took his sister's life, and, according to the article, his father died of a heart attack less than a year later. He blamed Harrison Vance for all of it. He believed your father was a murderer who got away with it, building an empire on the ashes of his family. The cold fury that had sustained Alara for days solidified into something heavier, darker. This wasn't about prejudice. It wasn't about arrogance or a flawed hospital system. Not entirely. This was a vendetta, a 30-year-old blood debt that Alistair Finch had been waiting patiently to collect. The dismissal at the gala, the condescending remarks, the deliberate delays in the ER. They weren't random acts of a biased doctor. They were targeted. They were personal. He hadn't just seen a man he deemed unworthy of his time. He had seen Julian Vance, the husband of Harrison Vance's daughter, and he had seen an opportunity to make her suffer, to make her feel the same helpless agony his family had felt all those years ago. The fight was no longer about reforming a hospital. It was about surviving a ghost. The revelation landed with the silent, concussive force of a bomb, shattering the foundations of Alara's understanding. The world was remade. Every interaction with Finch, every dismissive glance, every polite, condescending word, was now cast in a new, sinister light. He wasn't just a negligent doctor. He was an executioner who had been waiting 3 decades for his moment. The news about Julian came an hour later, delivered by a junior cardiologist. Not Finch. It was the bombshell that followed the aftershock. The minor cardiac strain was, in fact, a significant myocardial infarction. The delayed diagnosis and treatment had resulted in permanent damage to the lower wall of his left ventricle. He would survive, but his heart would forever bear the scar of Finch's vengeance. A part of his vitality, his easy, boundless energy, had been stolen from him. Alara stood by his hospital bed, watching the steady, reassuring rhythm of the heart monitor, a machine that now seemed to be mocking her. She had failed to protect him. While she had been gathering her forces for a war of attrition, Finch had already won a decisive, devastating battle. The grief was a physical weight, a pressure in her chest that mirrored the affliction she had been unable to prevent in Julian. But beneath the grief, the ice of her fury began to reform, colder and harder than before. This was no longer just about justice. It was about retribution. She met with Marcus Thorne and Ben Carter in a sterile conference room, the air thick with unspoken gravity. She laid out the new reality. He didn't want Julian to die on his watch, she said, her voice a low, chilling monotone. That would have been too obvious, too easy to trace back to him. He wanted to damage him. He wanted to inflict a wound that would never heal, a constant, living reminder of his power over me. He wanted me to watch the man I love slowly diminish, just as he watched his own family fall apart. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, steepled his fingers. This changes the strategy. A lawsuit for malpractice based on systemic bias is one thing. This is premeditated. It's attempted murder by negligence. But proving it will be nearly impossible. His motive is buried under 30 years of history. In a courtroom, his lawyers will paint him as a grieving son, and you as a vindictive heiress trying to deflect from your own family's sins. I'm not interested in a courtroom, Alara said. The words hung in the air, sharp and definitive. Courts offer justice. I want to dismantle him. I want to take away everything he has built, everything he values, his reputation, his career, his wealth, his standing in the community. I want him to feel the same powerlessness he inflicted on my husband, the same powerlessness I felt as a child. This will not be settled by a jury. It will be settled in the boardroom of Williams Medical Corporation. She turned to Ben. The factory fire. Finch believes my father was an arsonist and a murderer. I need to know the truth. The whole truth. Was the fire an accident? Ben hesitated, his usual confidence tempered by the gravity of the question. The official report says faulty wiring. But reports can be manipulated. Your father was a powerful man. Even then. I'll dig deeper. I'll find the original fire marshal's investigation. Talk to anyone who's still alive. But Alara, you need to be prepared for what I might find. I am, she said, though a cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She had spent her life trying to redeem the Vance name, to transform a legacy of ruthless capitalism into one of compassionate philanthropy. The thought that it was all built on a foundation of ash and blood was a possibility she had never allowed herself to consider. Her first move was decisive. Using her authority as a minority shareholder, she formally requested an emergency meeting of the Williams Medical Board of Directors. The stated purpose to address a catastrophic failure of patient care and leadership at St. Catherine's Hospital. The request sent shockwaves through the corporate structure. It was an act of open rebellion, a direct challenge to the established order. The board, a collection of conservative, risk-averse executives, was accustomed to handling problems quietly, through internal reviews and confidential settlements. A public emergency meeting was their worst nightmare. Finch and his allies on the board didn't wait for the meeting. They launched a preemptive strike. The city's most influential newspaper, a publication whose publisher sat on two of the same charity boards as Finch, ran a front-page story. The headline was a masterpiece of character assassination. Grieving heiress or vengeful tycoon, Alara Vance, accused of using family fortune to destroy doctor's career over misunderstanding. The article, quoting anonymous hospital sources, painted Alara as an unstable, emotionally overwrought woman, lashing out in her grief. It detailed her disruptive behavior in the emergency room and hinted at a personal vendetta against the highly respected Dr. Finch. It subtly reframed the entire incident, transforming Finch into the victim and Alara into the aggressor. The blow was swift and effective. The narrative she had been carefully constructing, one of medical negligence and systemic bias, was being overwritten by a simpler, more insidious story: the hysterical, powerful woman. Her phone began to ring. Board members who had previously offered quiet support were now hedging their bets. "Ilara, this is a public relations disaster." One of them, a man named Harold Steinberg, told her, his voice tight with anxiety. "You're making the entire corporation look unstable. Perhaps we should handle this through the proper internal channels." "The proper internal channels are the ones that protected him for years," Alara shot back. "He tried to kill my husband." "Harold, this isn't about public relations." "That's an extreme accusation. Ilara, right now, it's your word against that of one of the most respected cardiologists in the country." The walls were closing in. Finch was using the system against her, wielding his reputation like a shield and public opinion like a sword. Her allies were wavering, retreating to the safety of the status quo. She was being isolated, painted as a villain in her own story. This was Finch's home turf. He knew how to manipulate the levers of power and perception. She stood in Julian's quiet hospital room, the offending newspaper lying on a chair like a coiled snake. Julian was sleeping, his face etched with a new, permanent weariness. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, so potent it threatened to drown her. Finch was going to win. He would weather this storm, his reputation intact, while she would be dismissed as a vindictive hysteric. He would have his revenge, and she would be left with the wreckage. But then she looked at Julian's sleeping face, at the faint scar peeking out from the collar of his hospital gown, where the catheter had gone in. She thought of the 30-year-old wound that Finch carried, a wound that had festered into a poisonous, patient hatred. And she thought of the wound she carried, the memory of smoke and helplessness. The despair receded, burned away by the cold, clean flame of her resolve. Finch had underestimated her. He thought this was a battle of reputations, of public opinion. He was wrong. This was a battle of wills, a war of ghosts, and she would not be the one to be exercised. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. "The board meeting is in 2 days," she said. "I don't care how many allies I've lost. It's going forward. And Marcus, tell Ben to tear the world apart if he has to. I need the truth about that fire. Everything else depends on it." The storm broke on the day of the board meeting. A furious, theatrical tempest that seemed to mirror the turmoil brewing inside the Williams Medical Corporation's headquarters. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows of the 40th floor boardroom, the sky a bruised canvas of gray and black. Thunder rattled the glass, a low, percussive accompaniment to the tension coiling in the room. The space was designed to project an aura of unassailable power. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the grim faces of the 10 board members. These were the titans of the city's financial and medical establishments. Men and women accustomed to quiet consensus and the orderly preservation of wealth. Today, their composure was a fragile veneer. Alara sat at one end of the table, a solitary figure in a severe, dark gray suit. She was the picture of calm, her hands resting on a single, slim leather portfolio. Across from her, at the other end, sat Dr. Alistair Finch. He was flanked by the hospital's legal counsel, looking every bit the victimized professional, his expression a careful blend of sorrow, resolve, and righteous indignation. Harold Steinberg, the board chairman, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the charged silence. This emergency meeting is now in session. Ms. Vance, you have made a series of grave allegations against Dr. Finch and St. Catherine's Hospital. The floor is yours. Alara rose, her movements fluid and deliberate. She did not raise her voice. She did not betray a single shred of the maelstrom of emotions inside her. She spoke with the precision of a surgeon. "Members of the board," she began, her gaze sweeping across their anxious faces. "On the night of the St. Catherine's Legacy Gala, my husband, Julian Vance, suffered an acute myocardial infarction for 3 hours and 14 minutes. He was denied appropriate medical care by the head of cardiology, Dr. Alistair Finch. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not an error in judgment. It was a deliberate act of medical negligence, rooted in a systemic culture of bias that Dr. Finch has cultivated for years." She opened her portfolio and, with the help of a silent assistant, began her presentation. The data flashed onto a large screen at the front of the room: charts, graphs, internal hospital metrics, the 48% longer wait times for minority patients, the 32% lower admission rates. She presented sworn affidavits from 6 former nurses, including Chloe, detailing Finch's 2-tiered system of care. She played a recording of a phone call with a former patient, a retired bus driver whose wife had died of a massive heart attack in the St. Catherine's ER 2 years prior, after being diagnosed by Finch with anxiety. It was a meticulous, damning indictment, built on facts and data. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not the emotional outburst they had been led to expect. This was a corporate execution. When she finished, the room was silent, save for the drumming of the rain against the window. Finch, however, looked unperturbed. He rose slowly, his expression one of tragic forbearance. "What Ms. Vance has presented," he said, his voice laced with sorrow, "is a carefully constructed fiction, born of grief and a desire to find someone to blame. The truth, I'm afraid, is far more personal and far more painful." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Ms. Vance's animosity toward me has nothing to do with statistics or hospital protocols. It has to do with a fire that took place 30 years ago, a fire set by her father, Harrison Vance." A collective gasp went through the room. Alara felt the blood drain from her face, but her expression remained a stony mask. "Harrison Vance was a ruthless man," Finch continued, his voice resonating with the conviction of a lifelong truth. "He wanted my family's land. When my father refused to sell, he burned our business to the ground. That fire didn't just destroy my family's livelihood. It took the life of my 9-year-old sister, Amelia." He looked directly at Alara, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. "Harrison Vance was a murderer who built his empire on the ashes of my family for 30 years. I have lived with that truth. I have dedicated my life to saving the lives he saw as disposable. Ms. Vance's attack on me is not about justice for her husband. It is an attempt to silence me, to bury the sins of her father under a mountain of false accusations. She is trying to finish the job her father started, the complete and utter destruction of the Finch family." The narrative had been flipped. The boardroom was no longer a tribunal for medical negligence. It was a trial of history, of family honor. The board members looked from Finch, the grieving son, to Alara, the daughter of an accused murderer. They saw a blood feud, a personal vendetta, and their instinct was to distance themselves from the wreckage. Steinberg was already opening his mouth, likely to suggest tabling the entire matter pending an independent investigation. This was Finch's checkmate. He had played his hidden card, turning Alara's own history into a weapon against her. But just as the tide of opinion was turning irrevocably against her, Alara's phone, lying face down on the table, vibrated once. It was the signal she had been waiting for. Ben Carter had come through. "You are right about one thing, Doctor," Alara said, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is about the fire." She stood and walked to the head of the table, her presence commanding the room's absolute attention. "You've spent your life believing a simple story of good versus evil, where my father was the villain and your family were the innocent victims. But the truth, as it so often is far more complicated and far uglier." Her assistant dimmed the lights. A new image appeared on the screen. It was a scanned document, old and yellowed. The letterhead read, "City of Northwood, Department of Building and Safety, Structural Integrity Report. This is a report commissioned by my father 2 weeks before the fire," Alara explained, her voice steady. "He had concerns about the structural integrity of the Vance Textiles building. The report found that due to a contractor's error and substandard materials, the main support beams were critically flawed. The building was at risk of a catastrophic collapse." A low murmur went through the room. "A collapse," Alara continued. "That would have not only destroyed his factory, but would have sent several tons of steel and concrete crashing directly into your family's dye works next door. It would have obliterated everything. He was advised that a proper retrofitting would take 6 months and would bankrupt him." She clicked to the next slide. It was a coroner's report. "This is the report on your sister, Amelia," she said, her voice softening with a genuine, unexpected wave of pity. "You believed she died from smoke inhalation. You were wrong. The coroner's report, which was never made public, states the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. It occurred the day before the fire." Finch stared at the screen, his face a mask of disbelief. "What? What is this? This is a forgery." "This is the truth you were never told," Alara said, her eyes locking onto his. "There was a partial collapse. A single beam fell from the roof of my father's factory. It struck your sister while she was playing. It killed her instantly. Her death was a tragic, horrific accident. An accident caused by my father's criminally negligent building." The truth landed in the room with devastating force. Finch staggered back, gripping the table for support. His entire life's narrative, the righteous fury that had fueled him for 3 decades, was disintegrating before his eyes. "My father was guilty," Alara stated, her voice resonating with the terrible weight of the confession. "He wasn't a murderer in the way you believed, but he was responsible for your sister's death. And instead of facing the consequences, instead of accepting the ruin that would have followed, he made a monstrous choice. He panicked. He covered it up. He started the fire himself. Not to destroy your business, but to destroy the evidence of his negligence, to make it look like the structural damage was caused by the blaze, and to erase the scene of the accident that killed your sister. He sacrificed your family's livelihood to save himself from prison and financial ruin." The storm outside raged, a flash of lightning illuminating Finch's face, revealing not a confident pillar of the community, but a broken, bewildered man. A man whose entire life had been built on a lie. "My father was a coward," Alara concluded, her voice ringing with a clarity that was both an indictment and a liberation. "And you, Doctor, in your blind pursuit of a misbegotten revenge, have become the very thing you thought you were fighting. You saw my husband, and you didn't see a patient in need of your help. You saw a symbol. You saw a chance to balance a scale that was never tipped the way you thought. You chose vengeance over your oath. You chose to inflict pain rather than heal it. You are not a victim. You are my father's echo." She turned to face the stunned board. "This is the legacy we are dealing with. a legacy of secrets and moral compromise. The question before you now is simple. Will you continue to protect a man who has not only proven himself to be a negligent physician, but has used this hospital as a staging ground for a personal vendetta? Or will you choose a new direction, one of transparency, accountability, and a genuine commitment to the patients you claim to serve? The choice was no longer complicated. The moral high ground, which Finch had so confidently claimed, had crumbled into dust beneath his feet. Alara had not only defended herself, she had exposed the rot at the heart of their institution, a rot that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. She had seized control, not through force, but through the undeniable, devastating power of the truth. The hostile takeover was complete. The aftermath of the board meeting was a quiet, sweeping purge. Finch, stripped of his reputation and his righteous fury, resigned before he could be terminated. His allies on the board followed suit, disappearing from the corporate masthead like ghosts at sunrise. The Williams Medical Corporation, under the new and undisputed leadership of Chairwoman Alara Vance, had been irrevocably altered. The storm had passed, leaving behind a city washed clean, the air sharp and clear. But inside the quiet, private hospital room, the emotional wreckage remained. Julian was awake, sitting in a chair by the window, a book lying open but unread in his lap. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deeper. He had watched the live-streamed feed of the board meeting on his tablet. He knew everything. Alara sat opposite him, the space between them filled with the weight of 30 years of secrets. "My father," she began, her voice faltering for the first time. "The man I spent my life trying to honor. He was a man who made a terrible choice." Julian finished for her, his voice gentle. He reached across and took her hand. His grip was weaker than it used to be, but it was still her anchor. He was a flawed man, Alara, like all of us. What he did was unforgivable, but his sin is not your own. But the Vance fortune, this hospital wing, the foundation, it's all built on that lie," she whispered, the shame a bitter taste in her mouth. "It's poison fruit from a poison tree. Then we cleanse it," he said simply, his gaze firm and loving. "We don't hide from the truth. We don't let it define us. We use it. We use the power we have now to build something better, something honest. That's how you honor the victims. All of them." His words were a balm, a grant of a permission she hadn't known she needed, the permission to move forward. The weight of her father's legacy, a burden she had carried her entire life, began to lift. She was not her father's daughter in that way. She would not hide from the truth, no matter how ugly. The next day, Alara called a press conference. She stood before a bank of cameras, not in the corporate boardroom, but in the hospital's main lobby, surrounded by doctors and nurses. She did not offer a sanitized corporate statement. She told the whole, complicated story. She spoke of Dr. Finch's negligence, of the systemic bias her investigation had uncovered, and then, with a steady voice, she told the world the truth about the fire, about her father's guilt, and about the tragic death of Amelia Finch. "The Vance family owes the Finch family a debt that can never truly be repaid," she said, her words stripped of all artifice. "And Williams Medical Corporation owes its patients a promise of absolute accountability. Today, we begin to pay those debts and honor that promise." She announced the immediate implementation of the Julian Vance Protocol for Patient Equity, a system-wide overhaul that mandated immediate diagnostic testing for all patients presenting with critical symptoms, regardless of their demographic or insurance status. She announced the creation of an independent civilian oversight board with the power to investigate any and all claims of discrimination. But her final announcement was the one that stunned the room into silence. She was liquidating a significant portion of her personal inheritance from the Vance estate. The funds would not be used to build a new tower or fund a research grant. They would be used to purchase a tract of derelict land on the south side of the city. The same land where the Vance Textiles Mill and the Finch Artisanal Dyes Works had once stood. The press, a cynical and jaded pack, was momentarily speechless. This was not how the powerful behaved. They did not confess to sins, tarnish their own names, and give away their fortunes to atone for the crimes of their fathers. Alara Vance was rewriting the rules. In the quiet aftermath, as she walked away from the podium, she felt a profound sense of release. She had not just won a war. She had liberated herself from a haunted past. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer held any power over her. She was finally, completely, free. 6 months later, Alara stood on a patch of land that had been a scar on the city's landscape for 3 decades. The last of the rubble from the old factory had been cleared, the earth graded and seeded. The air, once thick with the ghosts of industry and tragedy, now smelled of fresh soil and new beginnings. A small crowd had gathered community leaders, journalists, and residents of the once-forgotten neighborhood. Julian was at her side, his health much improved. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet pride. He held her hand, his grip strong and sure. Alara stepped up to a simple wooden podium. There were no corporate banners, no gilded plaques. For 30 years, this ground has been a monument to a tragedy, she began, her voice clear and strong, carried by a gentle breeze. It has represented a story of loss, of secrets, and of pain that was allowed to fester across generations. Today, we begin a new story. She gestured to the cleared land around them. This will not be the site of a new corporate headquarters or a luxury condominium. This will be the home of the Finch Vance Foundation. A murmur of surprise went through the crowd. The foundation, she continued, will be dedicated to community restoration and ethical enterprise. It will provide seed funding for local businesses, offer scholarships for underprivileged students, and house a free legal clinic for those who have been wronged by powerful systems. It will be a place built not on profit, but on the principle that a community is only as strong as its commitment to healing its own wounds. She paused, taking a breath. This work cannot be done alone, and it cannot be done without acknowledging every part of the history that brought us here. Behind her, a large screen flickered to life. On it appeared the face of a woman in her late 50s, her expression gentle, but marked by a lifetime of quiet sorrow. She was broadcasting from a simple room in a modest rehabilitation center hundreds of miles away. "My name is Eleanor Finch," the woman said, her voice soft but steady. "Alistair Finch is my older brother. Amelia Finch was my sister." A hush fell over the crowd as they recognized the name. "I have spent my life in the shadow of my family's tragedy," Eleanor continued. "I watched my brother's grief curdle into a desire for revenge that ultimately consumed him. For years, I believed the same simple story he did, that Harrison Vance was a monster who destroyed our family out of pure greed. But in recent months, thanks to the courage of Alara Vance, I have learned the more complicated and more painful truth." She looked directly into the camera, her gaze seeming to connect with Alara's across the distance. "Atonement is a difficult road," she said, "but it begins with truth. The Finch Vance Foundation is not about forgetting the past. It is about building a future worthy of the lives that were lost and the lives that were damaged. That is why, today, I have agreed to serve as its first co-chair. The announcement was a final, stunning surprise. It was not a corporate merger or a legal settlement. It was an act of grace, a bridge built across a chasm of generational pain. It was a testament to the idea that true victory isn't about destroying your enemy, but about finding a path to a shared redemption. Alara looked out at the faces in the crowd, then at Julian, and finally at the open, waiting land. The cycle of revenge had been broken. The ghosts had been laid to rest. Here, on this ground once defined by ashes, something new and beautiful would be allowed to grow. Her revenge was complete, not because she had destroyed a man, but because she had reclaimed a legacy, transforming a story of darkness and ruin into one of hope, healing, and rebirth.